you need to know here. So we had finished by talking about the foraminifera. Remember that we are still talking about what are considered the micro zooplankton, meaning these are all very, very tiny, usually one cell in size. So the foraminifera are a single cellular organism, and they had those calcium carbonate shells to them. Okay, the last microzooplankton we're going to talk about are the ciliates. And again, these are single cell. And as you would expect from the name, the ciliates have cilia. Okay, the cilia are those hair-like structures that surround the outside, and it helps them with feeding and locomotion because it moves the water. Here's just some pictures of various cilia. Some have more obvious cilia than others. Some of these have shells, others don't. And these are found in both marine and freshwater. All right, so what I'm going to show you on this slide is called the microbial loop. Essentially, we're going to take everything we've been talking about in terms of nutrient cycling, phytoplankton, and zooplankton, and we're going to talk about how all of those things get the nutrients where they need to move up the food web. So everything here on this blue loop would be considered the first trophic level. So basically, these are your primary producers and your very, very low zooplankton. So this picture to the far left shows your phytoplankton. The phytoplankton can either be eaten by very small zooplankton, or it will die and fall to the bottom. And we know that when it dies and falls to the bottom, it still is available as nutrients, but some more things need to happen to it before other organisms can ingest it. That's where the bacteria come in. Okay, so the bacteria at the bottom will take those dead nutrients and they will convert them into some type of usable nutrients. And if you recall the last class, we talked about the nanoflagellates. These were a microzooplankton that were capable of fixing that nitrogen and using it to reintroduce it into the food web. Okay, so then those microzooplankton can also get eaten by slightly larger zooplankton. And essentially, this is what keeps the nutrient cycle continuing at the very lowest level, our first trophic level. As we move into some of the larger organisms, like the meso and macro zooplankton, and then into the larger invertebrates, that's when we're going to start moving up the true trophic levels on the food lab. So everything we've really talked to about at this point has been just that basic first trophic level. Okay, so let's talk about some slightly larger zooplankton now. So we're still talking about the zooplankton, and the next level, next size up would be considered the mesozooplankton, slightly larger. Just going to talk about a couple of these. One is called the rotifers. They can be up to about 1/2 millimeter in size, so they may be visible, but usually they're not. And just like many other plankton, they have cilia that they can use for feeding. But these organisms can also engulf other zooplankton or phytoplankton whole. So it's kind of like endocytosis would be in a cell. They'll basically ingest things whole. These are more common in freshwater, but you can find them in saltwater. All right, this is probably the most important zooplankton we're going to talk about. It is considered a mesoplankton just because of its size, but these are called the copepods. And looking at them, you'll notice that they look a lot like little crustaceans, like crabs or shrimp. And in fact, they are actually in the same class as those organisms. The difference is that copepods will never ever get bigger than about 0.5 millimeter in size. Okay, so these spend their entire life as plankton floating in the water column. So even though they are tiny, they are the most abundant animal on the entire planet. The copepods are the most abundant animal. As a matter of fact, the next most abundant animal would be the insects, and there are 1,000 times more copepods than there are insects on the planet. If you were to take all the copepods out of the ocean and the freshwater and put them on a very large scale, and then on another scale, you took every human being on the planet and put them on the other scale, the copepods would outweigh humans by 100 times. That's how many there are. Okay, so why am I giving you all this information? They are really, really significant in the food web, okay, because there is such a large biomass of them that if anything happens to affect their numbers, it can be detrimental to the entire food web. So if you were to go out to the ocean and do a plankton net drag, in other words, take one of those nets I showed you pictures of and drag it through the water, you're going to come up with almost entirely copepods in your net. So while you will get other plankton, it will be primarily copepods because of that number. All right, you are not responsible for these body shapes because we will talk a little bit more about them when we get to the larger crustaceans, but I did just want to show you how much they look like a standard crustacean. They do have a head region, what we call a thorax, and an abdomen, and then they also have 10 legs, which is common among the crustaceans. So we'll talk more about that later. So I'm going to show a short video of a copepod feeding. The copepods do eat phytoplankton, but rather than eating them in the typical sense, they do what is called filter feeding. So essentially, they open up their mouths and they let all the phytoplankton flow in through their body and they pull out the nutrients they need. You'll notice he uses his legs to help move the water. So you can just observe the feeding patterns. The teeny tiny little particles floating around in the water are the phytoplankton. They'll show a close up here in a moment. Oops, I want wanted to bring this forward and pause. Oop, come on. So you can actually, because these little guys are translucent, meaning you can see through them, you can see the phytoplankton, the green, building up there in their gut. So that shows that they are feeding there. Okay, finally getting to some slightly larger organisms. We are now up to the macroplankton. So these are visible to the naked eye. They range about 2 millimeters to 2 centimeters. So some of them are quite large in terms of plankton. Again, really, I'm just going to list some common organisms here. We have what are called amphipods. They're more commonly known as sand fleas. Again, these are all part of the crustaceans. They're just small, very small ones. The mysid shrimp. And if you've ever owned a sea monkey kit, you had some krill in your kit, which are also known as euphausids. You don't need to know those names though. Okay, so krill are a type of zooplankton. Now, while these look a lot like their crustacean counterparts, they're larger ones, the difference between what classifies these guys as zooplankton compared to the other ones is they spend their entire lives as plankton. Remember, we're still talking about the haloplankton, which spend their whole lives as plankton. So these guys will never ever grow any larger than plankton size. These krill, as tiny as they are an extremely important part of the whale diets, particularly the whales that filter feed. They're called baleen whales. Again, we'll talk more about those guys later. But essentially, these whales will come up to the surface with their mouths open and flush the large numbers of krill into their abdomens and then push all the water out. So this is a humpback whale feeding on krill. Okay, some more of our macroplankton. These look like snails, and in fact, they are related to the snails, but they are called pteropods. Same class as the snails, but they're very, very tiny. Okay, so 2 millimeters to 2 centimeters. And these guys are neat because in order to stay suspended in the water column, they use what is there would be a foot on land for a snail, and they've turned them into like a set of flaps that are almost like wings. So they flap these feet and it keeps them suspended. There are some forms that have a shell called shelled pteropods, and then there are some that don't have a shell. And this particular one is called a sea angel, even though it's essentially a slug in the water. Not so angelic, but they are kind of cool looking. In the left side, you can see the size of one of these compared to a copepod, which happened to make its way into that picture. So they are much larger than our mesoplankton. All right, next we have our hydroids. And when you first look at these, you may say, hey, those look like jellyfish. And in fact, it's because they are related to the jellyfish, but again, they are plankton size. So these are the teeny tiniest of the jellies. The term hydroid actually refers to the body shape. You'll notice that most jellyfish have a bell or a vase-shaped body shape, and that in fact is called a hydroid. So the hydroid is the shape of a vase, or we'll just say like a vase. These hydroids can live singly, but they can also form large colonies. And one of the most famous colonies of these hydroids, of these zooplankton that are very, very tiny, are called the Portuguese man of war. So the official term for this is a siphonophore. You don't need to know that. But what the Portuguese man of war is, it is not a jellyfish. Okay, so many people think that this is a very, very scary jellyfish. It is not a jellyfish. In fact, it is a colony of many, many teeny tiny zooplankton hydroids that have collected together. And they have adapted a way to create an air sac that essentially keeps them afloat. So all of these little tentacles that are hanging down are thousands and thousands of individual hydroids. And we'll talk about more of this when we get to the actual jellyfish, but every single one of these hydroids has what are called nematocysts. They are stinging cells. Again, we'll talk about these again. But that is why when you touch these organisms, it hurts so much, okay? Because they essentially will sting you. And we're going to go into much more detail on the nematocyst later. Because these are actually colonies and they can form long, long chains, much longer than a single organism, the Portuguese man of war can actually have tentacles of hydroids that are several dozen meters long. So you may see the head or this gas pocket and think you are safe if you are a long ways away from it, but the tentacles can reach very far. So you have to be very careful if you see one of these in the water. I did actually see one of these pushed up on shore once, and it was really cool. I've never seen one in the water though, nor do I want to.
Wait, are they like in the East Coast?
Yep, you can find them right off the shores at the beaches, you know, Atlantic City, Delaware, all of those. So you always have to be careful if you see one of these. That and their tentacles can break off too, so they may be free floating in the water. Okay, another jellyfish looking organism that is not actually a jellyfish is called a comb jelly. The fancy name for it is a ctenophore, but a comb jelly is all you really need to know. So these comb jellies, again, they look like jellyfish because they're basically a clear blob of jelly, but these guys do not have any stinging cells. So you could go into the water with thousands of these and they will not sting you. So these can travel, I'll say travel, they travel in large groups. So essentially like schools, they call them swarms. So when you see these in the water, you're going to see a lot of them. And a lot of people at the beach, if they don't know the difference between a jellyfish and a comb jelly, they'll panic because they'll think they can't get in the water. But in fact, these guys are really safe. They can't hurt you at all. These are typically about the size of a fist. So these are very visible in the water. You will see these. You don't need to know the anatomy. I just put these pictures up here because they're kind of cool. So their tentacles are used to help them move, but they don't have any stinging cells on them. All right, another fascinating macrozooplankton is called the arrowworm. And it's called the arrowworm because it is a worm, and it has a head shaped like an arrow. This is a close-up picture of an arrowworm. These are nasty critters. They are actually carnivores. They eat other zooplankton, and they will also even eat fish larvae. But these prongs here that are coming out the side are actually its jaws. So it has like grabby jaws. Again, you don't need to know the scientific name here, but they are called the chaetognaths. This is an organism that the fisheries usually have to control because if they get too dense, they will kill all the fish larvae. All right, we're almost done here with our zooplankton. All right, next we have what are called the sea salps. And we'll talk about their very close relatives later. But the salps are translucent and they can exist as singles or in colonies, as you see here on the right. They're very cool because you can see their organs. The little red dots here and the yellow show you where their organs are. And we're going to talk more about these later, but even though they are teeny tiny, they actually have a primitive spinal cord. One thing that's unusual about this invertebrate is whereas most zooplankton are found near the shoreline, the salps are usually found out in the open ocean. So this is something you'll find floating out in the middle of nowhere. Okay, so remember, all of the zooplankton we've talked about so far, whether they're the micro, the meso, or the macro, they are considered haloplankton, meaning they spend their whole life as zooplankton. They will never get so big that they can't suspend in the water column. The next few organisms we're going to talk about are called meroplankton. Meroplankton just means that part of the life cycle is spent as plankton. And there's quite a large number of organisms that have meroplankton. It's usually their larval forms that will live in the water column, and then once they become adults, they become benthic organisms or free swimming. So one example is barnacles. So we know that barnacles, I'm sure you've seen them, even if you don't know a lot about them, they will attach to the hulls of ships, docks, etc. They form a shell, and then the organism actually lives inside that shell. But they are attached, and they are obviously not free floating in the water column. But their babies are. So when they have their offspring, they release them into the water, and they swim around until they grow large enough to reach adulthood. Okay, so they spend part of their time as plankton. Clams also release larvae that are free swimming. And it's not until they form their calcium carbonate shells that they will settle to the bottom and live the rest of their adult lives there. Shows a little bit of basic anatomy here, but we'll go into that in more detail. Okay, sea urchins also have larval plankton, and they tend to look nothing like the organism that they turn into. I've just shown one particular type of crab here, but most of your crabs and other crustaceans will have a larval form that is free swimming, as opposed to like the krill, which are haloplankton and spend their whole life in the water column. These guys only spend part of their life there, and then as adults, they're no longer considered plankton. And then finally, we have the fish plankton. So basically, depending on the size of the fish, sometimes the fish larvae are so tiny that they are simply free floating until they develop their swimming fins.